So as we look at Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, we see that he ministered to and interacted with a lot of people in a lot of places. And so we see that he ministered to large groups like the 5,000 and the 4,000. And he had his followers, like the group of 500 and the 70. But then he had his faithful few, the 12, and then even the 3. And as we consider the use of Jesus' time, while he did minister to the large groups, if we were just to compare the amount of time he spent a considerable more amount of time with a few people. So Jesus' time mattered. How did he, as he's engaging large groups of people, determine who he was going to invest the majority of his time in? Who were his faithful few? So we want to determine that in the Scriptures. Those of us who are disciple makers or catalysts or missionaries, we want to be able to determine from the Scriptures, did he give us any indication of how he determined who he was going to pour his time into? So go ahead and take some time at your tables, or if you're by yourself, and look up these passages and ask yourself the question, is there any type of filter that Jesus used to determine who he was going to invest his time into? Okay, so let's just real quick take a look at these. We see in Matthew 10 and in John 6, Jesus used what we would call hard sayings, right? The challenge of in John 6, he's got this massive group that he's feeding that are there to follow, that are there to see Jesus, and he uses the hard saying of, "You must eat my flesh and drink my blood." And the disciples are like, "Lord, this is a hard saying." So Jesus used hard sayings, and the large groups of people following him would actually shrink down. In Matthew 13 and in Mark 4, we see that Jesus used parables on purpose as a filter. And then in Mark 10 with the rich young ruler, we see Jesus uses lordship, of people being willing to submit to his lordship. For example, this man was unwilling to leave behind the one thing that he couldn't let go of, was unwilling to submit to the lordship of Jesus. And so we see there's other passages we could look at, but these are 3 categories, examples of filters that Jesus used to determine who he was going to invest his time in. So as we consider our Four Fields training and the process that we have, one of the things that is exciting is if we consider a filter. We hate to, because these are people, these are lives, right? So, but if we were just to use that term of filtering for who we're going to invest our time in, the 3/3 format actually has these 3 filters built in there. I mean, think about it. The look back portion is hard sayings, right? You think about the loving accountability of asking somebody, tell us how you obeyed Jesus this week with respects to the goals that you set last week. That's a hard saying of how did you obey? People don't often like to hear that question. You think of look up, parables. We're looking at a new lesson from the Word, often looking at parables from the Scriptures. And then for the look ahead part, we see the lordship filter in there, asking the question of how are you going to obey Jesus this week, and setting some very specific goals they're going to make its way into their calendar that week. So these 3 filters that Jesus used are actually in the 3/3 process that we use for discipleship and church formation and leadership development. And what we're finding is that most people, they'll choose to self-select out, just like in John 6 or in Mark 10. People are choosing to leave Jesus. He's not asking them to leave. And we're finding the same as we roll out these 3/3 groups. There's discipleship training groups that we're not asking people to leave, but when we ask the tough questions of did you obey and how are you going to obey as we're looking at the scriptures, people end up self-selecting out. And often leaders can feel like, man, we're failing, we're losing people. And we never want to lose people. We want to train and see everyone get involved in making disciples. But as people do leave, especially if we're sticking to the process, just know that that is going to happen. I've talked to leaders that feel like they're doing something wrong, so they'll try to take out the things that are difficult, take out the accountability, take out the goal setting. It's like you've just removed the teeth. So this 3/3 is a helpful process that's built into the tools to help us consider as we minister to the masses. How do we identify who are those faithful few that we're going to pour our lives into, at least 60 to 90 days a year that we're going to invest, just like Jesus did?